So I have with me someone who worked behind the scenes on the original Crystal Maze show for the entire 6 series. It's David G. Croft. Hello.
How are you, Jack?
Not too bad, thank you. Yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. And it's kind of you to call, and I'm very pleased that you're interested in the original shows.
Yeah, it was one of my favourite shows growing up, and I'm still a massive fan now. In fact, last night I was actually even watching a couple of the old editions for a bit of research.
Okay.
So you worked on the show. What were your roles on the Crystal Maze?
Okay. I helped. I was hired as the director, and I was hired before the first series was made. And I was hired by Malcolm Hayworth, who owned Chatsworth Television, who were the company that were making the series for Channel 4. So my involvement before a frame had been shot was helping develop the show, because when I got on board, there was an awful lot about the Crystal Maze that hadn't been worked out at all. So I was very pleased to be involved in helping to shape the format. And then, of course, I was involved as the director. I was involved in all of the pre-planning, worked very closely with Malcolm Hayworth and James Dillon, who was the designer of the set. So the three of us worked very closely on the format. And then, as I say, I had to plan the shoots, the huge logistics involved in the first series, which we shot in Shepperton Studios. The set for Crystal Maze was massive. It was probably the biggest entertainment game show set ever built, because it was a real set. It was a real 4-wall set, and you could walk round it. So we built this in Shepperton Studios, and so my task was to direct the series, which of course is always a challenge for a director on a show, that's never been made before. You encounter all kinds of problems and challenges, but it was fantastic fun. And our schedule was such that we had 5 weeks to shoot 13 episodes. Of course, Richard O'Brien was presenting. I then went on to direct Series 2. I then produced Series 3 and 4, because I quite fancied having a rest from directing it. But finally, the final 2 series, Series 5 and 6, I directed and produced them. So I was very fond of saying to people I did absolutely everything on the Crystal Maze bar to present it.
It sounds like you did. You had quite a big involvement.
I did, and also in the early days leading up to Series 1, of course, I found myself also creating games, which was quite interesting because I'd never done that before. I mean, one of the big challenges of Crystal Maze was that each series we had to create 48 games, which was quite a daunting task. And when I would sit in my office and look at a blank wall and think, oh my goodness, by the 1st of November we've got to have filled that with 48 games. But yeah, I found that I could create, I found that creating games for the Crystal Maze was something I could do. So I also did that, along with several other people that were part of the games creation team.
Can you remember any of the games that you did create?
Oh gosh, no. I can remember one. Yes, it was stuck in my mind because we used it more than one series, and it was called Rat Run. And it was a game where the cell basically was like a rat cage, and there were 3 floors to it. And there were like little ticking clocks inside, and the contestant had to climb in, scurry around the rat run, and to find the clocks to switch them off. That was one. Another one I came up with. Sometimes I would come up with games. I would go to the games builders. Now, the people who built all the games were a fantastic company called Artem, and a chap called Simon Taylor oversaw the building of the games. But sometimes I would go to Simon and say, I'd like to use a robot and a laser gun. So sometimes I would start from a purely visual point of view. I remember saying to Simon once, I'd like to do a submarine game, and then he would often tell me whether this was possible or not. And if he'd said yes, it was, then we would sit down and say, okay, so what's the game? So it was great fun. It was great fun, and a lot of Crystal Maze games were based on, because games are a little bit like jokes and stories. There's only so many of them, and what we would often do is we would take a game, and you might recall if you've watched them all, and we'd upscale it. So one game I particularly remember, which was a good example of that, was you can buy little cubes made out of like 6 pieces of wood that slot together in a certain way.
Yeah.
Well, we did that, only we made the cube, 4 feet high. So we would do that too. We would look around. It's like, do you remember there was quite a lot of tile sliding games?
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
Well, we used to get those when I was a little boy. We used to get those in lucky bags, and it was like, here's this little game. The numbers are all jumbled up. Can you slide the tiles around so the numbers read 1 to 10? So we would do things like that too. We were quite inventive, But as I say, 48 games a series was a lot to find.
Definitely. The one thing I wanted to ask as well was, how did the show come about? Because the story I've read is that Channel 4 wanted to do Fort Boyard but couldn't.
Okay, you're quite right, and people sometimes get confused about this. So I'll tell you the whole story. All right. Now, when Malcolm Hayworth rang me up and said, would you be interested in directing this adventure game show, I said, yeah, okay, because I'd not long been freelance from the BBC. So I went to his offices, and he showed me a version of Fort Boyard, which was shot in a studio. Richard O'Brien was presenting it, and I always remember Richard was wearing a yellow shirt and tight yellow trousers. And it was a version of Fort Boyard shot in the studio. Now, the reason they had to shoot it in the studio was that the French company who had created the Fort Boyard format, they were going to shoot the series. Their intention was to shoot the series, which they did in the end, in a fort off La Rochelle. All right. Problem was, the fort wasn't ready or habitable to shoot. So Malcolm had bought the rights to this format, Fort Boyard, and he'd taken it to Channel 4, and Channel 4 had said, we're really interested. Chatsworth had pretty much self-financed this pilot, all right? And so he showed it to me, and I went, well, I'm kind of vaguely interested, but not completely. And I remember saying to him, you've seen Fort Boyard, Jack?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Right, so you know at the end where they've got the tigers?
Yeah.
So I always remember saying to Malcolm, so what are the tigers for? Are you going to let the contestants be eaten by a tiger? He went, no. And I said, so what are the tigers for? So that's all show and dressing, isn't it? He went, well, actually, yes. I went, So I was a little bit hesitant about committing to it, because it was all right. But anyway, what happened was that Malcolm Hayworth then discovers that the fort is not going to be ready when Channel 4 wants the series to be shot, which was in November. So, of course, the prospect of trying to shoot on a fort in November and the fort isn't organized properly was like, no, we're not doing it, right? So Malcolm has a problem now because Channel 4 have said, we like this, we'd like you to make this series. So he goes back to Channel 4 and says, I don't want to make this series called Fort Boyard because they're not ready. How about we come up with something different. All right? You following me so far?
Yeah.
Right. So he rings me up and he says, "Come in, David." He says, "Look, we're not going to do Fort Boyard, but what we can do, we can create a version which is different, but based on the principles, of 6 people going around and 1 person going into a cell and playing a game." So we go to the French and we have several meetings with the French. And we talk about doing a version of Fort Boyard which doesn't look like Fort Boyard, but is based on their principles. Okay, so they agree because, of course, they're very happy because they're still going to get the money for it because whatever we come up with is going to be based on Fort Boyard. So at one of our meetings, they say, "We've got something to show you." And we go, "Okay." So we get in a car and we drive to an industrial estate in Paris. And we get out the car and they opened a warehouse door and there is a crystal dome. And we said, "This is fascinating. What are you doing with it?" They said, "We don't know. We just built it to see if it would work, but we don't know what to do with it." So I think that was the germ of the idea. So we went back, Malcolm and I, and as I say, then we recruited James Dillon, and between the 3 of us, and with some help from the French, we fashioned the format called the Crystal Maze. And it was our idea to have 4 zones and the different time zones and all of that stuff. So is that making sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So, yes, we were a kind of offshoot. But, of course, the French said to us, whatever show you make's got to look sufficiently different to Fort Boyard so that we can make Fort Boyard in Europe and you can make Crystal Maze in the UK, and that they don't kind of look like the same shows, even though they sort of are. All right, I know it's complicated, it is, but that's what happened. So we suddenly decided. So we are now in a situation where we're making our version. It's called the Crystal Maze. It's all going to be shot in the studio, and we dumped absolutely loads of things that were in the Fort Boyard format. So there you go.
Oh, thank you for letting us know and clearing that up.
Yes, I know, it is a little... And, of course, it gets very complicated because when Crystal Maze finally comes off the air and Channel 4 no longer repeat it, guess what? They make Fort Boyard in the UK with Melinda Messenger and Dirty Den. So I had loads of people coming up to me going, "Wow, I've just seen Fort Boyard. It's awfully like Crystal Maze." And I would, there are similarities to Crystal Maze, and I would have to explain that actually the Fort Boyard format existed before Crystal Maze did. There were other things as well. There were other restrictions on us. The French were a bit tough with Chatsworth. One of the agreements was that Crystal Maze could not be shown in Europe while they were making Fort Boyard. So although I have to say lots of people from European television companies came to look at Crystal Maze and went, "This is so much better than Fort Boyard," they weren't allowed to buy it. So it was never shown in Europe. It was shown with great success in the Far East. The Indian subcontinent, they loved it. Singapore, it was shown in places like that. But it was never shown in Europe.
That's a massive shame. But the other thing as well that I wanted to ask, why was Richard O'Brien chosen to host, seeing as he wasn't a TV presenter, he was an actor beforehand? That's
precisely why we chose him. We did not want... You see, if I have a problem with the remake, which is that Richard Ayoade already has a personality. We wanted an actor, not a presenter. Malcolm and I agreed that what the host of the Crystal Maze was doing was they were being a character, not a presenter. Does that make sense? And that's why, also, we didn't want people watching it going, "Oh, that's that bloke from what's-her-name." We wanted the show to be as strange and unusual and different to the audience as we possibly could. So the last thing we wanted was a presenter where people would go, oh yeah, he does that other game show. So that's why we got Richard. And of course, Richard's talents as an actor, which were considerable, he was able to exploit across the 4 series that he was the presenter.
And it was the same process, I guess, when you chose Ed Tudor-Pole as well.
Absolutely. So when Richard decided after 4 series he wanted to leave, we tried very hard to dissuade him, but he felt he had done enough. So we sat down and we said, well, the same principle has to apply. We need to get someone where the audience go, oh, who's that? Now, we decided on Ed Tudor-Pole because he'd been in a band called 10-Pole Tudor. They'd had one hit called Swords of 1,000 Men. So he was in a punk band. That was cool, but he'd never been on TV. You know, he'd never presented anything on TV. So again, he had, and Ed was a trained actor. So we ran some auditions on the set. We ran 3 auditions, and Ed was one of them. And Ed turned up in his own in the outfit that he used to wear, more or less. And he was an absolute natural. So you know, it was pretty obvious. It was pretty unanimous for us that we should give him the gig. But you know, it was difficult because we were being at this stage we were being pressured now by Channel 4 to get somebody who was well known, and we're going, no, you're still missing the point. We don't want someone who's well known because you know they're playing a part like a character in a play. So
yeah.
That was our logic,
and a very good one.
Well, thank you very much. I do. I think we were absolutely right to do that.
Definitely. And you mentioned as well earlier on that Crystal Maze to begin with was filmed at Shepperton. But
yes.
It moved to an aircraft hangar after a bit, didn't it?
It did. So here's a story. So we've been commissioned for Series 2 because Channel 4, you know, it was a very expensive series to make, and quite often television series television series are given a second series before the first series is shot. Okay, that's quite often what happens. But we weren't. So we did Series 1, and they saw the audience figures, and they very quickly said, okay, do second series. So we rang Shepperton up and booked the same weeks. And then probably about 6 weeks before we were to start shooting, Shepperton rang up and said, sorry, you can't have the stage. And we said, why? And they said, oh, well, we've got a movie coming in with Kevin Costner called Robin, Prince of Thieves. And they are going to book all the stages on Shepperton. And that's so lucrative to us, I'm afraid we're kicking you out. So, of course, mild panic ensued in the production office. So what we did, we went to about 65 estate agents in London and said we need a big space. And what we kept being shown were warehouses. Problem with warehouses is that they have pillars holding up the roof, and pillars were no good to us. And the great thing about, as you can imagine, the great thing about an aircraft hangar is there are no pillars in an aircraft hangar because of the plane's wings. And we came across this guy, I've forgotten his name now, so long ago, Mike. And Mike actually owned an aircraft hangar on North Weald Aerodrome. And he used to keep bits of antique planes in there. And we went out there and had a look, and we went, well, hang on, it's right by the M11. It's on an airfield. Do we think we might have some sound issues? But the airfield, North Weald, is pretty much private, so it doesn't get used very often. And by the time we built the set, the set was so dense, we never ever heard the motorway. So that's how we moved to the aircraft hangar. And the great thing about it was that the guy who owned it was happy for us to leave the setup 12 months of the year.
Fantastic.
Which, of course, as Shepperton, we couldn't do. You know, we had to take that massive set down and put it into storage. So that's why it moved to its new home, and we stayed there for the next 5 series.
Great stuff. That's a cool story.
Yeah.
So how long did it take to film the show?
Well, it would take 5 weeks. So basically, what would happen is, let me try and get this right now. I'm trying to remember now. So what would happen is we would shoot a show on a Monday. Okay, so that's with the contestants and Richard or Ed on the Monday, right? Then on the Tuesday, I would have, and we basically shot the show, you know, with like 6 cameras and a Technocrane. On a Tuesday, I would shoot what were called pickups. So those were extra shots that I couldn't get at the time, all right? But I didn't need Richard or Ed for that. So and I would only need 1 camera, all right? So that was show 1. Then show 2 we would do on a Wednesday, and I would do pickups on a Thursday. Show 3 we would shoot on a Friday and do pickups on a Saturday, and then we'd all have Sunday off. So we were basically doing 3 shows a week. So it took us, you know, our production cycle, our shooting cycle was 5 weeks for 13 shows, and then of course they added a kids' Christmas special. So it was 5 weeks for 14 shows. So it was pretty demanding.
Very demanding. And the other thing as well, there was a big change in the 4th series of industrial going to ocean, which I have to say was my favourite zone because I loved how that was designed.
Yeah.
Why did that come about?
Well, it came about. James, Dylan, and Malcolm and myself had always talked about how at some stage we'd introduce a new zone or zones. But, of course, we knew it was going to be very costly. To be honest, the impetus came from Channel 4. Because the show was being so successful, Channel 4 said to us, hey, how would you like to take one of the zones out and put in a brand new one, and we'll give you the extra money for it. So that's how it came about. So, of course, what we then... The big challenge for us then was, well, what zone do we remove, and what's the new one? So I think pretty quickly we agreed that industrial was the zone that we'd like to get rid of. But then it took us a while to discover, you know, what kind of new zone we'd have. I seem to remember at one point there was, you know, we were quite excited about a Wild West zone, or a zone that would be in, you know, like, you know, these scientific, at Antarctica and the Arctic, you know, they have these scientific enclaves.
Yeah.
Where scientists spend, you know, it's 6 months of the year they can't even step outside the door. That was another thought. But in the end, I think we all got really excited by the idea of, you know, the sunken ocean liner. That it was always down to, you know, what did we think was going to be the most visual, what was going to give us the, you know, what was going to give us imagery for games. And so that's why we went for the sunken liner, and I think James Dillon did a fabulous job.
Yeah, he did. It's my favourite zone. And do you have a favourite zone?
No. I know that sounds strange. I loved them all. And they all gave me special challenges. So no, they're like, you know what? They're like children. You know, if you say, who's your favourite kid? It's like, no, I'm sorry, they're my children. I love them all equally.
Oh, fair enough. I did read a rumour online that if the show had carried on after the 6th series, there'd been more zones added. Is this true?
Well, Yeah, I think that's the case. Yes, but why the series came off? I think I don't know all of the politics. I mean, the show was still delivering figures. It was still doing, as we say in the industry, it was still doing the numbers. But of course, back in the 1990s, that was a different era for television. Nowadays, if a series is successful, it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. We've only got to look at the X Factor and Strictly Come Dancing and The Apprentice. Back in the 90s, everybody was kind of, much more confident, less worried about, the demands of getting an audience were not as great. There wasn't satellite TV, there wasn't Netflix. So so the feeling that you could end a show even if it was successful was something that would enter commissioning editors' heads. They'd never do it now. So I think in the end it was a case of Channel 4. My understanding is that Channel 4 said to Chatsworth, well, you've done 6 series, that's great, we'd like to move on to something new. So I think that's the case. Yes, had we have gone on, and I think we should have done, we would have introduced another zone. I think we probably would have phased out Aztec. But yeah, we would have, definitely. So there you go.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. And I agree, actually. I think it should have gone on a bit longer, but there we go. But I suppose you'd never have guessed when it finished that it would still be so popular now. And the old ones are still being aired, and we've got a revival on the air now.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And it's one of the things, I have to say, Malcolm and I are incredibly proud of the fact that, we made a piece of television which, 25 years on, is still being watched. Most television entertainment is ephemeral. It's made, it goes out, and that's that. But I'm very proud of what we did, because I do think we planted a bit of a flag in the landscape, and I think we did make something special. And which, as I say, I'm really proud of that fact. And I'm absolutely thrilled, as I know my Malcolm is, that there's still an audience. And yes, I would never, ever, ever have guessed about that the reruns would still happen, and let alone that they would make a new series. I mean, there were over the intervening years, after it came off the air, there were times when there were discussions about whether they should bring it back, but they were never prepared to spend the amount of money. I remember being involved in discussions about, let's do a kids Crystal Maze, but only do 3 zones, and it's like, why would you want to do that? And we'd need to make 2 in a day, which is kind of what they're doing now, and I think the new series suffers for the fact that, but you see, this is modern television. Modern television won't give you the kind of money to lavish the care and attention on something that we were allowed to do. I know, because I've been down and met the people on doing the new Crystal Maze, who are lovely and are doing it for the right reasons and are fans. But they're having to make 2 shows a day. It took me 2 days to make 1 show, and I think it shows on the screen, Jack.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing as well, I forgot to mention earlier on, were you aware that some of the Christmas tapes have made their way online, and it features your amusing commentary over some of the games?
Yes. I am very aware of that, and it's obviously some very naughty crew member who's put them up there. I mean, I'll tell you about the Christmas tapes. Christmas tapes have been made by TV programs, for a long time. In America they call them bloopers. So you put together the funny bits, and we had lots of funny bits, things going wrong and stuff like that. And also the crew over 6 years, the crew, we built up a certain number of sayings and shorthands about how we spoke and stuff. And yes, I think people on Talkback, the crew began to realize that often the stuff I said was quite funny. And then unbeknownst to me, they started recording it. But we would make a Christmas tape. Not me, it would be the engineering department. They'd record all the funny bits and they'd put it together. And then there became a ritual, which was when we had finished the last show, we would have what was called a wrap party. And at the wrap party, the Christmas tape would be screened. And then everybody on the crew would be given a VHS of the Christmas tape. So whoever's put them up there, it's somebody who works on the show. So yes, I am aware of it.
The thing is, the things that you say about the contestants is pretty much what the viewers were saying as well. So don't worry about it.
No, I know. But and again, what was it? I think it was last year. Somebody sent me a clip, and I'm thinking, oh God, this sounds like I'm being really unpleasant. It wasn't, obviously I loved that show. But yeah, it's true. Sometimes the contestants drove me nuts because, particularly the one where the guy's picking up the skeleton, which has got nothing to do with the game.
It's funny actually because when I spoke to my friend about Crystal Maze, that was one of the things he mentioned. He said, "Have you seen this on YouTube with the skeleton?" Yeah. I was like, "Yes, I have." And I'm speaking to the guy who is the one saying all that.
Well, and of course, there's a certain amount of, with those comments, there's actually a certain amount of hidden tension because, of course, I'm wanting the game to go well, but it is funny, and I don't blame the contestant because, one of the challenges always in Crystal Maze was, the contestants were told virtually nothing about, that was the whole point, virtually nothing about the game. So they'd step into the cell, and to be fair to them, they often didn't know what was part of the game and what was set dressing. So our poor skeleton, who was just set dressing, I was a bit disingenuous, really. I think I'd have done the same thing. I'd have thought, there's a skeleton, it might be hiding something. But it is funny.
It is very, very funny.
As long as people don't take it the wrong way, because it was meant with the best of intentions.
No. Like I said, I think we all made the same comments watching it. I know I have in the past watching the show. So the show has recently been revived. Have you watched much of it? Do you enjoy it?
I've watched two. Yeah, I was. They kindly invited me down with Malcolm to have a look, which was very weird because James Dillon has rebuilt the set. So it's very odd. I walked on Industrial and I thought the last time I stepped on in this place was in 1994. That was very odd because it's pretty much exactly as it was. So we went down, had a look round, watched a bit of a recording, and yeah, I've watched 3 or 4 episodes. I think I've got very mixed feelings about it. Obviously, I'm delighted that they've brought it back. But for me, there are things about it that don't work for me. But there are lots of things about it that do. I love its energy. I like the fact that it's quite, it never takes the mickey out of the original series. Its humor, his humor is supportive humor, I think. But there are things about it that don't work for me. I don't think it has the visual scale that the original series had. I think I'm not sure it's a good idea that the contestants know each other. Actually, I mean, again, one of the deliberate things with us was that the contestants didn't know each other until they met the night before. We felt that was an advantage, you know. We felt that put them under pressure. And yeah, I think actually one of the things I have talked to them about, whether they've done anything about it, I don't think the sound is as good. You know, we had atmospheres for each of the zones, and I watched the new Crystal Maze, and it sounds to me like it's in a studio. So you know, again, that may be just a function of the fact that they're having to make them really quickly. You know, Malcolm and I were great believers in the soundscape that went with the show. You know, we wanted you to believe that you were in a strange place, you know, that you would suspend your disbelief and you would go to this place called the Crystal Maze, which you didn't know where it was, but that it was weird. And a lot of that came from sound effects and Atmos tracks and stuff like that. And I don't think the new series is quite, you know, knocking it out the park in that area. But, you know, good on them.
Definitely. It is good to see it back, and I was shocked.
What do you think? What do you think of the new series?
I think I'll agree with you on it doesn't look as big on screen. It doesn't have that grand scale to it. The one niggle I have is it doesn't really show them properly travelling between the zones.
No, it doesn't. And I can answer one of. I can give you an insight into why that is.
Okay.
And the insight is this: that when we made Crystal Maze in Shepperton and we made it in the aircraft hangar, all of the zones were joined up. That's why I said it was a fully functioning set. You could walk around it. So literally, you know, there was a moat which you walked with a bar across it, which you had to walk across to get from medieval to futuristic. There was a lift in futuristic that you went up, and there was a wall that you had to climb down to get into Aztec, and so on. Now, we could only do that because the set was all laid out, and James was able to join it all up. So I was able to shoot what we would call them crossovers. When we went from one zone to the next, I would deploy all the cameras on that, and we would shoot the whole crossover. So you'd see it in real time. The new series is made in a studio in Bristol where James has not been able to join the sets up. So you literally see them go through a door, and then that's it, cut, and then you see them coming out of a door into the new zone. So that's why, Jack.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame. But I said to my friend, I said, surely you could build a fake tunnel and kind of fudge it with some editing, but I suppose that's money and time.
It's money and time, and in the end, you know, they'll be going, who cares, you know?
Yeah.
And it's true that some of the, as I recall it in the original series, you know, sometimes a commercial break would happen during the crossover. So they've probably decided, you know, making TV shows, there's a certain amount of compromise you've got to do. They found a studio, it's available, the price is right, but it meant they can't join the sets up, so they'll get round it. So that's the insight into why that is.
Which is a bit of a shame, really. And I'll agree with you on them knowing each other, because the one thing I think that's lacking with the new one is if it's a load of strangers, that you don't really care if they get locked in. There was almost a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? It's like if you're friends with everyone and they get locked in, then straight away you're just going to go.
You're just going to buy them out.
You're just going to buy them out straight away, and there's none of that. There's none of that jeopardy. There's none of that bitchiness. You know, there's none of that in it.
I agree with you, and I think, you know, we really wanted the captains to transmit, you know, to the audience that there was strategy involved. You know, do I leave this guy in because if I do, we've got an extra 5 seconds in the Crystal Dome? This was a decision. and we wanted the audience to recognise that that was a strategic decision made by the captain. So you're right, with them being strangers, it was easier for them to leave people in if they were struggling for crystals.
Oh, it's fair enough. And yeah, it happened a lot more in the old one, but it doesn't seem to in the new one. But
Yeah.
it's good to see it back anyway. The one other thing I was always curious about the old set is, what was the dome really in the centre?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't think it was.
It was in their new studio. It's not, but on our studio, it absolutely was. James built the dome in the middle of the four sets. But of course, you only part of, I was only able to shoot 270 degrees around the dome, because directly in front of it, was a whacking great crane and stuff like that. But yes, it actually was in the middle of the set.
I didn't think that would be the case, because when you watch the show, it's like, oh, how would you have been able to have squeezed that in the middle? And when they run out to to the dome, they go for a door that geographically isn't in the same place as it is. So I thought it'd be separate, actually. But thanks for clearing that up.
No, that's fine, and that is the one cheat that we always made. Whichever zone they ended up in, when Richard said right to the Crystal Dome, they would run out of shot, and the zones weren't connected to the dome the way that the four zones were connected to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because we just couldn't. We actually didn't have the space to for me to show them going through a tunnel and coming out. Because if you remember, they run out of shot, don't they? And then we drop down, and then we find them lined up in front of the dome. So yes, that's the one geography cheat that we did make.
So since Crystal Maze has finished, I mean, I've had a look at your website, an impressive CV of stuff you've worked on. I mean, tell us some of the other shows you've worked on down the years.
Oh, blimey! Well, I mean, I started off at the BBC in 1982 and started music directing. And I directed at the BBC. I did things like Whistle Test. I made music documentaries. What else did I do? I was one of the 3 Live Aid directors in 1985. It did lots of live music. Did programs with Michael Caine about acting. I did all kinds of things. But then I went freelance. Yeah, I went freelance in 1988. So I've done lots of stuff. I did comedy. I did Shooting Stars. I worked with Jonathan Ross a lot. I did some sitcoms. Did a sitcom with David Baddiel. Did Top of the Pops in the 90s. So yes, a lot. I did a lot of stuff. But after about 18 years of being freelance, I decided I wanted some form of change. I still love directing, but it's tough being freelance. You never know where your next job's coming from. And somebody told me about this new role, that there was a new television entertainment course had started at the National Film and Television School, and a friend of mine said, you should go for that job. That's, you've got all the experience. So I applied and I got the job. So for the past 11 years, I've been running an MA course in directing and producing television entertainment here at the National Film and Television School. And we're the only course of its kind in the world at MA level. That's what I'm doing. So I'm teaching, MA students how to direct television entertainment, both in the studio and on location, and how to produce television entertainment, both in the studio and on location. So that's me. I like to think that my big range of experience as a director, helps me deliver a quality course here at the school. So it's a 2-year course, the MA course, 2-year course. So I've been here for 11 years.
Oh, fantastic. And if anyone wants to check out what you're up to, have you got a website?
Yes, I have. And I sort of don't put much on it these days, but it's it's www.davidgcroft.com.
There we go.
That's me. And there's an extensive range of credits. And as I say, I've stopped professionally directing now because I've been in this job so long, and directing, as a freelancer is highly competitive, and unless you're out there all the time doing it, and gradually, I would still do stuff for the first 5 years, but gradually it dropped off as I knew it would do.
David, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for taking part today.
And anytime, Jack, and good luck.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye.
All right, bye-bye.